bit of an intro. So I just have a few notes. Right. So welcome everybody to the last in our current series of causality seminars organized through the Institute of Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. For the uninitiated, the Institute is a cross-cutting organization which takes in people from business and economics and social sciences and maths and computer science. And it's fantastic because everybody approaches causality in a different way. I was chatting with our institute manager the other day. David Spiegelhalter was quoted yesterday saying that epidemiologists shouldn't be giving public health advice. And his argument goes that public health advice needs input from economics and philosophy and social sciences, and it's not just about the epidemiology. And of course, that's a legitimate point to make. And I think all of our questions now are not siloed in one discipline. So it is increasingly important to have organizations like this, the IDSAI, where we do have this cross-pollination of ideas from business and now today philosophy. So it is with great pleasure that I'm introducing Sarah Wieten. We've never met. We have worked on this particular study, which Sarah's going to present on, and I am fascinated to hear what her take on it is, because I barely understand it, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what it actually all means. And so I'm going to hand over to Sarah. Ground rules, we have got some people who don't want to be recorded. So my plan is to stop the recording when we get to questions. So if you can hold your questions to the end, please do. Feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll be able to moderate them at the end then and get you going. Okay, so over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Mark, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here talking to you all. So today I'll be talking about this work we've done and a little bit of my philosophical reflections on this work. So my title is Just Say Association. That's what I hear that you're all often told to do in observational research. And I'm going to be speaking about on the use of causal language in the health science literature. So as I said, my background is philosophy, but I'm coming to you on behalf of a very large author team with whose makeup we will discuss in detail as we go. But because of that, my plan is generally to describe the study, talk about what we did, and then give two brief philosophical reflections. I'm still sort of teasing out sort of what I've learned from this empirical study generally about methods, about empirical research in general, and about causality and how this empirical work is going to interplay with a vast set of philosophical work on causality that I think is sometimes too detached from what's going on in sort of the causal inference world. So to talk about this empirical work, I'm one of many co-authors on it, and then give you two brief philosophical reflections. That's what we're up to today. So when I say that I am one of many, I am one of many. There are 48 people on this paper. Noah Haber is the lead author. Matthew Fox is here listed as our senior author. I'm not sure that we're necessarily using that in the same way that people usually do, but we've got quite a group here. Let's see, we heard from Mark introducing me just now, a great group of people who have never met many of us and work together based on online workflows. So this is our co-author team. None of this is possible without all of us. So I'm really excited that I get to be able to talk about this work a little bit, but I want to flag that it is not possible without this large group. And the group gets even larger when you point out that there were additional people who were not quite authors, but did give large amount of feedback on the protocol level, the big idea, were in the audience, and did lots of follow-up for times when we presented this work, found us on Twitter and gave feedback on drafts. So thank you to them as well. Okay, so what's the big idea of this study that I'm talking to you about today? The big idea is when you say things like, X causes Y, or X is associated with Y, or X makes Y more likely. What does that actually mean? So there's sort of a common practice, a common sense thing that occurs that if you're not really sure what you mean between these two, you might just say association. That's fairly common practice in health literature. At least that was our thought when we started this project. You see things like this sort of disciplined into these disciplines using things like the JAMA rule, right? This is a requirement that JAMA and its family of journals have, that if you do not do a randomized control trial, you should not be using causal language in their publications. The first time I was told about this, I said, really? That's really the rule? But you have a look. That is a rule on the books, a policy on the books at the JAMA family of journals. So sometimes there's also a lot of euphemism making around this issue. So there's lots of ways we can sort of hint that what we mean is that there's a causal connection here, but we don't use that causal word, so we don't get in trouble with JAMA, or if we're not really quite sure, we have all these euphemisms that are available. So Hernan has that famous paper. It's kind of unfortunately named the C word paper from Hernan in 2018. I think it's an interesting point, regardless of how it's titled. So there's also this disconnect possibly between what authors mean to do when they go out and study the effect of X on Y, or the relationship between X on Y, between what they intend to do, between the technical language, between what their methods can do and their intentions, and between the subsequent claims they make about what we ought to be doing when we take up their research. So there's a couple different things you can look to. I'll have that bibliography at the end. So there's been various attempts to establish lists of causal words, so that linking word, right? So to create lists of linking words and say, well, associate compared to cause, compared to causes a rise in, compared to, right? So these lists of words that may or have more or less causal meaning. There's been various attempts to create this sort of list. And if all of this seems a bit fuzzy, a bit too big picture, and we need some like more concrete example when we're talking about our framing, let's have a look at this. So you might see something like this in a paper. So we found that X may be correlated with Y. This evidence suggests we should reduce consuming X. Okay, so this is pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. You can imagine coming across this in a paper. So what have we got here? According to the way in which we sort of broke down these claims that we found in health literature papers, we've got here, we've got an exposure X, we've got an outcome Y, we've got a linking phrase correlated with, we've got a modifying phrase, maybe, right? So that's supposed to modify something about that linking phrase. And then we've got an action implication. Should we reduce consuming? We should reduce consuming X. That's that second claim, right? So those labels for the different parts of this claim, this kind of claim that you often see in the health literature, those labels are going to end up being important for what we pull out for our study. So we've got exposure X, outcome Y. This linking phrase is that correlated with. There's a modifying phrase, and we should reduce consuming X is our action implication, because we're going to come back later to sort of looking at the action implications and how they match up or do not match up with linking phrases. Right, okay, so a little bit more on the framing. So there's, in these causal linking words or phrases, we also include things like it implies that X influences Y, or levels or changes in Y, if any, would be attributable to X. Those would be the sort of things that show up as linking phrases. And then a little more detail about the action implications. We count it as action implications, any claim that can be made about how to use the results of the research that requires that causality has been inferred. So it becomes causal when that causality is inferred by the claim itself. Okay, so a little bit more about big ideas, and then we'll get right into the details. So the big idea is that all of this sort of uncertainty, the euphemisms, lack of clarity about what these linking words mean, how they're used, how they relate or don't relate to action implications in papers, could have lots of different consequences, right? So it could result in poor communication, double standards, poor quality of methods and evaluation, inappropriate strength of evidence hierarchies. It could devalue useful non-causal associations, right? So if we make it that what everyone really wants to be doing is making claims about causes, that can end up devaluing perfectly good research that just happens to not be about cause. There's lots of other interesting work that science does besides make causal claims. It's just important to be clear about which is which. So this situation we're in, this lack of clarity has these possible bad results. We're worried about that. So we worked on a set of objectives. Let's start with our primary objectives. What are we looking to learn? We wanted to learn what linking phrases are used in literature. So we're going to identify the associational or causal linking words and phrases that are used to describe these relationships. We want to do this in the high impact published health literature, just to see how does this look in the literature that might get taken up by policymakers, right? So there's an additional need for clarity there. So we also wanted to generate estimates of the degree to which linking words and phrases state or imply causality, right? So we were going to be part of that bibliography, that list, attempting to make a list of linking words that are more or less causal, right? We want to examine the prevalence of recommendations and action claims that would require that causal inference have been made. So how often is that happening in papers? And we wanted to examine the prevalence of disconnects between the linking words you're using and the action claims you're saying. So how strong is your linking words, and how does that have any impact on the action claims that your paper makes? We had some secondary objectives, which include developing this list of linking words, specifically itself, to document how the type and strength of language changes between title, abstract discussion, and action implication. Right, so there's some idea possibly that there could be differences between these, or some idea that maybe the title would be stronger. You can imagine, based on your knowledge of the health literature, what the kind of worries you might have about differences among these. And we also were interested to identify differences in the types and strengths of language used across different types of studies and journals. Maybe it makes a big difference between public health and medicine, or between epidemiology and medicine, or something like that. So maybe there's something that matters there in terms of different disciplines or different journals doing things differently. Okay, so we need to take a step back and talk briefly about how any of this was really possible. So a brief big picture interlude. So this work would not have been possible without the huge author team we had. This is a mega collaboration. We recruited people from many different disciplines. We were really interested in having a mix of people who are more senior in their discipline, people who are more junior, with a little bit of an emphasis on junior folks. We wanted to involve people at the beginning of their career. We wanted to involve folks from different countries, folks from different backgrounds, and we wanted them all to be co-authors, right? So we wanted everyone involved to have opportunities to do things like work on the protocol, to make changes to the way that we trained each other, to make changes to the final paper, things like that. So, so this is a really interesting sort of meta level thing that was different from this work that doesn't happen in all other work, in that it was part of this sort of mega collaboration on a really huge scale, with a 48-person review. We looked at over 1,000 articles as a group, and we really framed this review intentionally as guided, right? So the idea isn't that we just tossed in people to review these papers and capture their untutored intuitions about them. And there's a training, there's a guidance process that goes through to be able to look for the linking words, to be able to find the action implications. Does this count as an action implication, or does this not count as an action implication? So we were interested in framing this review as there is it's not just intuitive, there is a guidance process. And that means that necessarily what we find is going to be subjective, is going to be reflected in that guidance process. There's interesting work stuff that happened here in terms of group dynamics, in terms of we're working across different time zones, we're communicating using Slack, we're trying to make sure we keep our version control, time management. All of this is really interesting for me as a philosopher. This is I mean, the usual method of work in my field is very much you get your books from the library and you read them and you think about them very hard and you maybe circulate a draft to one or two people. So this is quite different than what I was used to. And then we also were interested here in sort of hyper transparency. I think if I recall, this is best reflected by, I think Noah wrote some of the protocol in public on the internet. I don't remember which tool he used, but sort of anyone could pop in and ask him questions while we were and contribute to the protocol. So yes, we did lots of pre-registration work. I'm happy to talk about that more, but there were just additional transparency components to this project that were sort of interesting on a meta level. Right, so details. The methods, what did we do? We did a systematic, guided, subjective, large-scale, replicable review. We reviewed 1,275 plus articles from 18 high-profile journals. These are a random sample of high-profile health, medicine, epidemiological published research in the last 10 years. So what did we do? First, we searched and screened for the articles. Then we did a main independent review of these articles. Then we did an arbitration review of the reviews of the articles. So we added an additional level of arbitration between our reviewers. And then we did this root word exercise. Okay. So you've got your PRISMA diagram here, just to show you sort of how did we end up with the group of articles that we ended up with. It's fairly detailed. I'm not going to walk you all the way through it. But the idea is that we pulled journals in the health literature based on them being high impact. We removed duplicates. There was a consolidation process. And eventually, I'm not going to walk you all the way through it because I do want to save some time to do some philosophy at the end. So we ended up with 1,275 articles. Each of these were reviewed by 3 different reviewers. So a total of 3,825 reviews were done for this work. So what kind of journals? What were their inclusion criteria for these articles? At the journal level, we were interested in the journals that we included be high profile. We did this based on impact factor. In a lot of cases, I'm not super excited by using impact factor as meaning very much, but in this case, we're interested in including the journals that are sort of causing trends in how people talk about their research. So how high profile impact factor was maybe a good way of talking about this inclusion criteria. And we were interested in how this works in health, medicine, and epidemiology. I think it could be interestingly run in other fields. So if you're interested in that, you should email me and we should talk about it. When it came to articles, what were we including? We wanted these articles to be about a single exposure outcome pair. So if you were doing a whole bunch, no, that was not included. We also didn't include meta-analysis or reviews. Those were not included. So for our screening process, we started with a keyword search in PubMed. In order to do the screening review, there was a 1-hour training that Noah led. We did a title and abstract review to see if the articles met inclusion criteria. And then for our, we did these 3 reviews, right? So there's 2 original reviewers and then 1 additional arbitrator between these reviews to resolve conflicts. So this is a random selection stratified by journal, selecting out most RCTs. We did do a little bit, we included a few RCTs just so we could do one of our secondary goals was to see if there was a big difference between the way this is talked about in RCTs and the way this is talked about in non-RCTs. But that ended up being not a huge part of the thing. It's in the paper if you want to look at it. But so our target was 69 non-RCTs and 6 RCTs per journal. We just want to maximize our use of resources here. So what we do, for article selection, first we search for the articles and then we screen the articles for inclusion. Then we had this independent review process where we sort of established our baseline for data extraction. And then we had this arbitration around review where we take the first 2 reviews created by our reviewers and we arbitrate. Each person worked as an arbitrator to make sure that we produce the best possible review given the first 2 primary reviews. And then possibly the arbitrator would need to use their own reading and opinion to come to a conclusion. Okay. So again, 2 primary reviewers per article. All articles get that title and abstract review, so that part of each article was looked at. And then there was a third of our articles got additional in-depth, more of the text was looked at to see if there was a difference between the way linking words are used in, say, the title and the abstract versus conclusion, possibly. So in the title and abstract review, what did we do? We identified the exposure to the outcome. We identified the main linking sentence. We identified the main linking word or phrase. We identified the main action implication, and we looked to see if there was a causal implication of the action implication. Okay. So, and if we're going to go on to the next to do a more, that was that 1/3, right, group that got to do the more in-depth text review. Same set of questions, but we're done on the discussion and conclusions. This more in detail review also looked for causal disclaimers. So sometimes these papers will have things like, of course, as an X method, no causal claims can be described, right? So in this additional main text review, the reviewers were looking to see if those kind of sentences were included. And we looked for basic methodological information and to see if there were any causal theory discussion or if there were any models, like if they had drawn a DAG, say. So just to give you a glimpse of like what the reviewers were looking at when they're trying to look at a linking sentence and they're trying to decide the causal implication strength. If the answer was none, to get an answer of none, they would need to decide that in this article, the linking sentence does not imply in any way a causal relationship was identified. And these are our different definitions for the different levels. Similarly, for an action recommendation, when the reviewer is looking at an article and they found the action recommendation component, if they wanted to say that there was no causal implication, they could choose none, and the definition for that would be the action recommendation could be made appropriately in the absence of any causal relationship. And then you can see the rest of the definitions here. Okay. So the next phrase, we got our 2 reviewers. They've had a look at this article. Either they've done the title and abstract review or the more substantial review that includes the additional components of looking at the conclusion, the discussion, and seeing if there's any sort of causal claims made throughout the paper. So you finish that component. Now you're on phase 3. In phase 3, our arbitrator takes both independent reviews and tries to make their best judgment based on the 2 reviews that have already been done and add their own subjective judgment. I think there was some idea that the arbitrator has to just sort of go with what's been seen before, or should at least go with one of the 2 reviews that's seen before. But we wanted to have our arbitrators to have quite a bit of leeway to sort of make their own subjective judgments and sort of hash this out. The arbitrator has open to them several different options. They can use the best judgment. They can choose one of the reviewers' claims. They can choose somewhere in the middle, or they could overturn both. Okay, so the articles go through this additional arbitrator review phase. Okay, so all the way down to, you can see our PRISMA diagram. We're making progress through it. We're getting to phase 4. In phase 4 was our root word rating phase, in which we asked the reviewers to have a look at contextless root word rating. So we pulled from all of these articles the linking words, right? And we made a list of them that was sort of truncated to their root, where like the root of associated is associate. And we made a list of the most common words, and we gave them to our reviewers, and the reviewers gave us back how causal they took them to be without in-text context. So, of course, that in-text context makes a difference. We're interested to see what they make of these outside of that context. Okay, so reviewers. Who were these reviewers? What were they like? 48 different co-author reviewers. They were recruited mainly from social networks, some personal social networks, and an awful lot from Twitter. We had representation from a wide diversity of backgrounds. We were interested in people who would be potential consumers or potential producers of health research. So who are they? Just to give you a little bit of an idea. We've got, in terms of primary fields, we had, a big group from epidemiology, but also some from economics. We got our two philosophers that are in there. We've got medicine, social work. When it comes to sort of backgrounds, we've got an awful lot of academics, but not all academics, also clinicians, other kind of folks. In terms of professional position, we've got, we were interested to include lots of junior scholars. So we've got doctoral level students and postdoctoral fellows, but it certainly wasn't just a group of junior folks. We had some senior faculty involved as well. And in terms of country, I think this is country of institution rather than country of nationality. But a big chunk of us from the United States, but many other parts of the world also included. Okay. So, results. This is results for non-randomized control trials, unless otherwise specified. We mostly focused on observational research. Okay, so the most common root linking word in these abstracts was associate, which you might have guessed. So we found that the root word was associate in 535 of the articles that we looked at. But have a look at some of these different root words. We've got change, decline, lower, relate, similar, demonstrate. We got all kinds of different words that are used to describe, to do that linking word work, right? What else we got? We got how strong overall were the causal implications of these in context, right? So these are the in context components. So we're looking at the strength of causal implication in the linking sentence. We've got in the abstract, we've got a nice big hunk on weak, some on moderate. In the discussion, just have a look. I don't need to read it to you, but I was very interested in this NA. Have a look at the NA and underneath in that second column, second line, strength of causal implication in action recommendation, right? So that NA there is because an awful lot of these articles had no action recommendations, many more than I would have guessed. Action recommendations were identified in 34.2% of abstracts, which was very surprising to me. I'm not sure if you found it surprising, but I did. So here we have the distribution of the linking sentence and action recommendation language among the non-RCT studies in which there was an action recommendation. So panel 1 is an unconditional heat map with colors representing the number of articles, and we got histograms on the top and right that show the overall distribution rating for each axis. So you can see we've got this nice area of heat and moderate. Some others maybe you wouldn't be surprised by. This panel shows the distributions within each level of linking sentence causal strength. So of the action recommendations that we have, how strong were they? Okay, so of the 34% of articles with action recommendations, so it's about 400, 44.5% of them had action recommendations that more strongly implied causality than the linking sentence. So there were 15% that were weaker and 40 that were commensurate, but that 44.5% had stronger, more strongly implied causality in there. And here's what we should do with the research than or here's what we should do in the world based on this paper, than they did in their discussion of the relationship between X and Y that they began with. You might also be interested in sort of like, hey, how often, Sarah, did you guys see a DAG, a direct acyclic graph, when you're looking at these papers in the health sciences? And the answer is very rarely, which is in line with other research that's been done on this point. So we had 10, and in terms of the use of a formal causal model at all, we had 10 DAGs that we found, and a few other formal causal models were included, but mostly none of the above. And a couple other interesting findings here in terms of were there any causal disclaimer statements in the discussion. We had 96 there were, but 294 there were not. The smaller numbers here are because this is just that group that got the more in-depth review than just the title and abstract. Title and abstract was for everybody, but a third of them got the more in-depth review, which is where we get this data from. Okay. Here you can see our distribution of ratings given by reviewers during that root word rating exercise. Right? So at the bottom, you've got cause, which we sorted as pretty strongly causal. And then at the top, you've got some words that we sort of disagreed about whether or not we're meant to take that as causal. So, so on the left side, they're sorted by median rating, the number of reviewers who would have to change their ratings in order for the rating to change. And then on the right, we have it sorted alphabetically. So if you have a favorite linking word, you could go and find that and see what we thought of it. All right, so some results summary. The most common linking word we found in the study was associate. Most studies used language that moderately or strongly implied causality. The vast majority of action implications implied that causality had been inferred. Action recommendations had a stronger causal language than linking sentences. And causal implications were commonly made through indirect means. So we found substantial disconnects in language and implications. There's a sort of a disconnect, a misalignment between the causal implications made in linking language when you're talking about, the relationship between whatever X and Y are interested in your paper and in the action recommendations. So when it comes to sort of what our discussion was, we focused on that current practices don't necessarily achieve clarity. It seems understandable that you could read this literature and be left with questions. It seems possible that some of this is a sort of rhetorical shield against methodological critique, right? So if you really want your work to be taken up to make a difference in the world, in direct action, but it's not clear if you make a claim at the top of the paper about a cause, people are going to be very interested in exactly what your methods are. So perhaps being sort of more gentle with those claims at the top of the paper is being used as a methodological critique, as a shield against methodological critique as soon as possible. We also thought perhaps there's something going on here that Peter Shannon likes to call Schrödinger's causal inference. That is, the same paper is and is not talking about anything causal, right? So, this often happens in methods, or top of the paper makes no causal claims, and then by the end you have made a causal claim. So that's his sort of framework for thinking about that. Involves this metaphor with Schrödinger from physics. There's this additional strange finding that even the word associate no longer seems to mean associate. We had some folks rate the root word associate as having some causal oomph to it, which seems odd unless people are being so often told to use the word associate when they're trying to choose a linking word that it just doesn't have a very solid meaning of any kind anymore. We have this big hunk of action implication, of papers that don't have any kind of action implications, that it's not made clear to the audience who's reading this paper what is it that the authors think they are meant to do with this information. So I suppose one way of looking at this would be to say, like, that is right? We leave the work of application to other folks. Others might say these missing applications need to be, there's a need to sort of fill in the blanks to have authors be more clear about what they think the takeaway, the call to action is in these papers. So our recommendation after doing this work is actually for less language policing around causality and more sort of honesty and clarity about what your goals are when you set out to write a paper, to do some scientific work, and more work to line up the methods that you use with the language that you employ. We also think that quantitative empirical research should clearly state its target estimate to clarify the research question, including explicitly stating when such estimates are causal. So we come to the end of my presentation of this empirical project I worked on, and to some brief philosophical reflections. So eventually I'd like to reflect on more on causes, right? This is the causal inference group. This paper is generally about causes. There's more than 2,000 years of philosophical work on causes. So I'm still not exactly sure what I want to say from a philosophical perspective after working on this paper. That said, I think there's plenty of other philosophical things to say about how this went. One, I think, is about authorship. So philosophers of science sometimes see practices of conferring authorship on large numbers of individuals in science as like a boundary case, right? The examples they usually like to point to are like from physics, right? Where not only is the guy who came up with the experiment, the person who came up with the experiment listed as an author, but maybe also the funding bringer, the people who brought the funding, the people who had the relevant equipment, right? The people who calibrated the equipment, right? There are many actions you could take that could cause you to turn up as an author on a physics paper. And philosophers of science sometimes say, like, they want to make some kind of modification to authorship as a means of credit distribution. Instead of, philosophers of science will sometimes suggest, like, instead of calling all of these authors, maybe we should be doing something to talk about credit distribution or prestige distribution in a different way, since some of this work really stretches like what it means to be an author. And part of the push for that, part of the, like, these big collaborative projects, maybe they don't have authors, from philosophers. I think part of that has to do with just the sheer number of people involved, right? Like there's an idea that the responsibility for the idea, a philosopher of science might say, like, can really the responsibility for these ideas be so widely distributed? Surely that has to break down at some point. And I think this project, this sort of research project, produces a counterexample in which the kind of tasks we generally take to be quite comfortable calling calling authorship tasks, really are done, even among this large group. So I think one thing I think is interesting is I think this project provides a sort of pushback to that claim that that maybe we should be modifying our conception of authorship, or we should be jettisoning these very large projects from a conception of authorship, and we should be calling them something else because this many people couldn't possibly really be authors. And I'm saying it looks like they can. It's just it requires a certain level of technological involvement and logistics work, but it's possible. The second sort of philosophical reflection I want to sort of briefly draw to our attention as we're finishing up is on that lack of action recommendations. I'm really stuck on this, right? I was surprised at how few papers included action recommendations. When philosophers of science are trying to describe what makes health research or medical research possibly different from science broadly, sometimes this distinction is supposed to be made based on like practical intent. So health sciences and medicine are different than chemistry because health sciences or medicine always have underlying them this practical intent of improving human health or something like that. Whereas other sciences don't necessarily have that intent underlying them, and it's perfectly legitimate quest of those sciences to provide additional explanations, right? There's no practical intent required for inclusion in a particular science. So the fact that a large number of these studies in health and medical research lacked action recommendations of any kind. No comment was made about what should be done in practice given the findings of the study. It seems concerning for that general program of splitting sciences or differentiating health sciences from other kinds of science, or medicine from other kinds of science. I think philosophers of science have a couple options here. They can attempt categorization on other grounds. They can look for evidence of practical intent elsewhere. They can say, like, sure, Sarah, they didn't have action recommendations in these researchers didn't have action recommendations in their papers, but practical intent, we can see that they had practical intent in some other way, so they could look for evidence of practical intent elsewhere. Or they could claim that I've uncovered a descriptive hiccup, but normatively, medicine and health sciences should be working from a perspective of practical intent. And so then their option would be to claim that current medical research needs to get back to be making explicit action recommendations broadly, regularly. So it's not that these empirical findings are sort of devastating to a program of differentiation based on practical intent, but that they narrow the options for the philosopher who's interested in making those distinctions, who's interested in talking about like how our science is different from each other based on things like this. And I'm interested in this generally from a perspective of thinking that philosophy should be responsive to empirical findings. So that was really an interesting example of that possibility. Right. So with that, thank you very much for coming to hear about this. Please check out the preprint of causal and associational language in observational health research, systematic evaluation. You can find it right now on that archive. Coming to you soon, hopefully. at American Journal of Epidemiology. We're still figuring that out. So if you'd like to have a look, I'd be really excited to have you look at that and let me know what you think. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was fantastic. If you could mash your reactions to say thank you to Sarah for that.
That's very good.
That was really, really fascinating. So I'm going to give you a second or two to